My name's Cole Andrew, and welcome to this presentation on behalf of Getting It Right for Me. I work for an organisation called Video Partners, and video literally means to flourish and to thrive. And our aim is in particular to support leaders in education and business and private settings, but to do so in an inclusive way, in a way that really helps people of all abilities and disabilities to thrive and find effective ways of working together as a team. I'm particularly passionate about helping leaders in organisations find effective ways of working towards achieving their goals, but also maintaining a healthy and balanced life in the workplace and at home. So the presentation is focused on evaluating the educational provision, i.e. the curriculum, for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. And I'm coming at this from several angles and perspectives, really. The first one is my own personal experience of learning difficulty in education. I also have an experience of being in the care system as a child, and I have two children who have a diagnosis of autism, as well as teaching and being a leader in primary schools, secondary schools and special schools for 30 years now, including headship in special school settings. I also have experience of evaluating curriculum through inspection work and through work as a local authority special educational needs and disabilities advisor. So several perspectives to bring to this today, and what I'm trying to do is to draw together my experiences of leading on curriculum development and my knowledge of the code of practice and the inspection framework, and to try and to draw them together into a proposed model of evaluating curriculum, and particularly in mainstream settings. Before I launch into that, I just want to remind us about the context in which the thinking that underpins some of the frameworks that we're working under now has come from. So the wording in the national curriculum around inclusive practice, the wording from Ofsted around the importance of the curriculum and developing memory skills, the wording that's coming out of the DFE concerns around exclusions. Many of the exclusions of children from schooling involve children and young people who have undiagnosed speech and language and other forms of learning difficulties. We know, for example, that quite a high proportion of people in the prison system have undiagnosed speech and language and learning difficulties. One of the organisations I work for is a youth justice system, and a large part of their work is unpicking the difficulties that the young people have faced in the education system and the undiagnosed learning difficulties that many of those young people have. So there's a national context to why the curriculum in particular is a focus for evaluating the impact schools are having on children and young people from vulnerable backgrounds, but particularly those with special educational needs and disabilities. This last 12 months has been a particular emphasis on this issue because, of course, the accessibility for our children and young people with learning difficulties to the curriculum online has been a significant challenge for schools to find ways, meaningful ways, for those children to access learning that is going to support them and help them. And that has been difficult. It's been difficult in terms of accessing technology, supporting parents and families, and supporting their children who may have particularly complex needs. Finding the right resources to help those families has been a challenge. For some schools, it's meant sending resources home, providing online training for families around the children to help support their children, as well as trying to find creative and meaningful ways for those children to interact with the technology directly themselves. And some of those children, of course, find that particularly challenging because of their learning difficulty. So there are lots of elements to why there is such a focus on the impact the curriculum is having on children with special educational needs and disabilities. And in particular in this time, as schools are in lockdown again, and hopefully getting back to face-to-face learning again at some point in the not too distant future, what does the provision and the quality of the curriculum look like for those children and young people who may have fallen behind? Equally, I am working with schools for whom children with special educational needs and disabilities have actually made good progress at home because of the amount of one-to-one attention and support that they've been able to benefit from. So there's a whole spectrum of responses these young people have had over the lockdown period. But it's fair to say that curriculum delivery is an ongoing challenge for schools. It's an exciting challenge. I think there are opportunities as well as difficulties in there. And it's also fair to say that the curriculum is an issue that is never completely resolved in the school, because it shouldn't be. It's always an evolving picture as professionals understand the needs of the children, seek professional advice, use their own professional expertise, look at research and evidence-based practice to continually evaluate what they're doing and to continually improve. So the model I'm going to share with you today will hopefully give you some structure and way of looking at your curriculum in this season and moving forward that might help you ask the right questions perhaps, and to think about a possible way forward with evaluating your curriculum for children with special educational needs and disabilities. So here's the first triad, and it's focused around curriculum. And as you can see, it's the interaction and relationship between the head teacher in governance, the SENCO, and the subject leader. And what I'm arguing here is that perhaps in the past, we've put a lot of emphasis on the subject leaders developing a curriculum content, and the SENCO then being asked to come and support a child or young person who isn't interacting effectively with that content for whatever reason. They're just not being able to keep up. Perhaps they're presenting some challenging behaviours, or perhaps they're just really struggling with accessing the learning for one reason or another. So the content is pre-written, and then the difficulties identified and issues and interventions put into place following that. What I'm suggesting here and moving forward is that there perhaps is a stronger role for the SENCO and the subject leaders to work together with this whole concept of quality first teaching. What I mean by that is there a shared understanding between the SENCO and the subject leader and the head teacher about what inclusive practice means within each curriculum subject area within the school? Is there a shared understanding of what inclusion means in that particular setting? That actually is a really good starting point in terms of the head teachers and SENCO and teachers working together to set the vision and values and the level of ambition that they have for different groups of children in the school, particularly those with SEND. So is there a shared understanding of inclusion? So let me give you an example, a scenario. I once visited a school to observe a young man in a Year 9 lesson who was presenting, I was told, some very challenging behaviours. And I arrived after the lesson had started. It was a maths lesson. And I sat at the back of the lesson to observe the class for a good 40-45 minutes. And by the end of that period of time, I could not tell you which young man it was I was meant to be observing, because there was no challenging behaviour at all. But what was going on in there was interesting. So the teacher hadn't identified necessarily completely different curriculum for that young man. What she had done is she put strategies in place that benefited all children in the class, and that's essentially what we call quality first teaching. So she had presented information in a way that this young man could cope with, because she acknowledged and knew that he had some difficulties with his literacy skills. So information was presented in a concrete way that he could comprehend. She explained concepts in a visual way that all the children could benefit from, the most able to the least able. She had a relationship with that young man that demonstrated she understood his social and emotional needs and difficulties, and was able to differentiate the way in which she targeted her questioning with different abilities and needs of young people in the lesson. I then followed that class to the geography department, and I knew within 2 minutes of the lesson starting which young man it was I was meant to be observing, because he had a complete meltdown. And what was the difference? The difference was the lack of consideration for quality first teaching strategies, and he just did not feel supported or that he belonged there, and his historical experience of that particular subject and the way that it was being taught, he knew what was going to happen, and he was going to struggle to access the information that was being shared, he was going to struggle to understand the concepts that were being taught, and so on and so on and so on. So there's a role here I would suggest for the SENCO and the subject leaders to work together more than perhaps they have in the past, to redefine what good quality first teaching strategies might look like in each of the subject areas, whether it be maths, PE, music, whatever the subject is, rather than have a predefined curriculum targeted at one ability group of children, the expected and the above expected abilities, for example, but for all abilities to be inclusive. And this is where the shared understanding of inclusion comes in. So the definition of inclusion I personally prefer that helps with this scenario is the concept that the individual young person feels like they belong. There are lots of other definitions of inclusion. There's no necessarily agreed version of it. So when you ask the staff to define for themselves what they think inclusion is, you often hear comments along the lines of, well, it's about children with learning disabilities accessing mainstream education, isn't it? That's one definition. And I hear lots of other examples across a whole spectrum of views. So it's important, I think, that there is a shared understanding within the organisation about what inclusion means to you as an organisation, as a school, in order to then be able to have a shared understanding about why quality first teaching is perhaps important, not just in core subjects, but across all subjects. So another example, take a PE lesson. What does quality first teaching look like in a PE lesson? Are the instructions just shared verbally, or can they be shared in other ways? Could visual cues be given? Could there be peer demonstration? Could there be video clips? Could there be photographs? And in good practice, you do see that happening. You see it happening a lot in lots of different schools that I visit. But is there a shared understanding amongst all teaching staff within the school that quality first teaching strategies in PE include X, Y, and Z, similarly in history and music and so on? So there's a role here in evaluating the curriculum together between these three elements. I don't think it is just the subject leader's role to evaluate the content of the curriculum. They have a key role to play in that. I don't think it's just the SENCO's role to determine what happens for children with special educational needs and disabilities. I don't think it's just the head teacher's role to cast the vision. I think it's a shared responsibility amongst all three elements to really consider effective, inclusive practice in each of the subject areas. So my challenge to you with this particular element, triad if you like, is to consider planning systems and processes in your meeting and training programs across 2020 and 21 and 22 to allow meaningful dialogue and collaboration between these three partners in each subject of the curriculum. In the process of doing that, clearly define, if you haven't already, quality first teaching content and strategies to feed into the staff training program for 2021-22 and beyond. And once you've got it set up, repeat it on a 3-year cycle. I would suggest that you do this by looking at each of the subject areas and thinking about quality first teaching strategies in line with the 4 dimensions of need in the code of practice. So the visual examples that I gave, you might put in, for example, the cognition and learning, or possibly the communication interaction elements of the dimensions of need in the code of practice. Similarly, what would you consider putting into quality first teaching strategies around social, emotional, mental health needs? What quality first teaching strategies would you put in for physical and sensory regulation difficulties, and so on and so on? So what strategies would you put into place for this? So my starting point, particularly in mainstream education, is to talk specifically about awareness of specific learning difficulties and what are the signs and symptoms of dyslexia? Are there some key elements that teachers could be looking out for and taking account of in the way in which they present information in lessons? That's just one example that I would throw in there. But really have a good dialogue between subject leaders, SENCO, and evidence-based practice and research. Spend some time on this. It does take time to really start this journey of working out together what effective quality first teaching strategies could look like. Now, some of those could be generic across all subjects, which would be really helpful and best use of time. But some of them I think might be subject specific. So music, for example, I'm not a musician, I'm not particularly musical, but I might need some support in teaching an effective music lesson in a primary school by being trained on what effective quality first teaching strategies in music might need to involve. So part two of my triad for evaluating the curriculum is the teaching pedagogy. So having really thought about this whole concept of quality first teaching and inclusiveness within the curriculum and within the planned curriculum for the children, we can then extend it out to these other elements, particularly when it comes to working out what is working or not working for children who may have special educational needs. So if you're confident, and this is important, that quality first teaching is consistent and delivered well across the curriculum, then you can confidently talk about whether or not the pupil has got a learning difficulty or whether they're just not being taught well. If quality first teaching is strong and effective within the curriculum, within the school, and you have chosen the right assessment tools to evaluate the pupil's response to that, then you can confidently start having conversations about, does this pupil have a special educational need, rather than they're just not performing or they need to catch up and so on. So that's really a really important element of the triad here, that you establish the quality first teaching, that it is consistent, that you're confident that it's consistent and the pupil's experience has been consistent, so that if they have still not made the progress that you're looking for and responding to the curriculum in the way that you want, you can then utilize your assessment tools to say, this pupil's had experienced high quality teaching, high quality first teaching, and they're still not responding and making progress in line with their peers. Therefore, we can confidently start talking about whether or not this pupil has a special educational need. Now, clearly, in some cases, the need is obvious because there's some kind of diagnosis or whatever. But if we don't know, and the child is just struggling to learn and develop, and I think these are the examples I refer to in terms of the national context. Some of these children, young people have been through the education system and become adults and not had their diagnosed need identified. So that's the starting point. Clearly defined in the ethos of the code of practice, that if there is good quality first teaching going on, sometimes called a graduated approach, that there's good high quality teaching going on, we can then more confidently talk about what support can be put into place to help that child catch up. And if that still hasn't worked, they've had intervention that's still not worked on 1, 2 or 3 or more cycles of the plan, do, review approach, then we can talk about actually there's a need for some real high quality external support or targeted curriculum provision to be put into place, which I'll come on to again later. So the interaction here is really important. We know research tells us that the best progress made by all pupils, but particularly those with learning difficulties, is the interaction between pupil, professional, and parent or carer. There's an equal responsibility here to plan and understand the needs of the pupil and work together to support those needs and help them develop. And the key, and the one that particularly that Osta have been talking about more recently, is this impact on the cognitive and the memory, particularly the long-term memory. So of all these strategies that are put into place, so let's say for argument's sake, the pupils experience high quality first teaching. So my example of the young man in the maths lesson, his needs have been assessed, and in that particular example, he's making some progress, but actually he does have difficulties with some literacy skills. So some intervention has been put into place, largely to do with quality first teaching, but perhaps there are some other interventions supporting him to ultimately impact on his long-term memory. And the key here is the curriculum, as it's being delivered, having that impact that you want on the long-term memory? Or is the curriculum being delivered in a way, and this is the pedagogy, is the pedagogy of teaching, you've identified the content, you've defined it, is the pedagogy of the teaching helping each pupil to learn and retain skills and knowledge in the long-term memory? Now, if a child or young person has a special educational need, there will be a challenge for them transferring that information into the long-term memory. So then that's the interaction again between the teacher and the Senko in identifying strategies, interventions, resources that might then particularly help that young person, just additionally from their peers, to retain information in the long-term memory. Is there lots of repetition there? So opportunities to plan and deliver the curriculum in a way where skills and knowledge are revisited and perhaps at a deeper level each time. Lots of opportunities for overlearning. And I would argue here, my approach would be that the greater the need, the tighter the spiral of revisiting skills and knowledge needs to be for that young person, where more able pupils may be able to move their learning on. They would still need to, I would argue, revisit skills and knowledge in a planned spiral approach, so that they revisit skills on a regular cycle, but again, perhaps at a deeper level each time, so that their knowledge and skills just gets better and better as they go. But children and young people with special needs might need a tighter and a more frequent revisit of some of those overlearning opportunities as they go through. So as you're evaluating your curriculum, the impact of your SEN provision, I would suggest looking at, having looked at the content, looking at the teaching and the pedagogy and the approach that is impacting, what strategies are impacting on that memory. Or are the children being adversely affected by the way in which we're delivering the curriculum? Is there an overemphasis, for example, on teaching to test and results? And the national research tells us that has perhaps been the case countrywide in many settings. And so children are being taught to hold information in their short-term memories that hasn't then been able to transfer into their long-term memories over a longer period of time. And the classic example there is the disparity perhaps between progress from one key stage to another, key stage 1 to 2, 2 to 3, primary to secondary, nurseries to reception classes and so on. There's some work to be done around that transition, but it will be best achieved by all settings having a real good focus on a teaching pedagogy that is helping children to transfer information skills into that long-term memory. I also have a personal view here, personal professional view, that understanding of child development is crucial here. It's something that teachers hopefully cover on their teacher training programs, on their ITT programs, but I wonder how often we revisit it and whether or not it's visited sufficiently enough for teachers to really understand the developmental steps that children and young people need to go through to make the most progress. because understanding those developmental steps will help teachers make the right decisions about the teaching strategies, the pedagogy that they put into place to help children with this whole issue of retaining information. So it's really important to plan the curriculum, the subject, in ways that is sequenced, that makes logical sense to the children, so that as they go from one year to the next, one scheme of work to the next, one unit of study to the next, that there are like building blocks, if you like, of building a house, that one brick builds on another and helps build the walls of the house. You know, the order in which you teach the content of the curriculum and the way in which you teach it needs to cement those bits together in a way that's helping children to retain information. So how I think about the challenge here is to review the way in which your curriculum is currently being implemented and establishing what impact is it really having on the long-term memory. And my challenge to you is to maybe ask parents, ask the pupils themselves, get some advice from subject specialists, from other professionals such as therapists, speech therapists, psychologists, and have different perspectives, different views on the impact your curriculum is currently having on the children's ability to retain information in their long-term memory. Having done that, you might then be able to identify the things that you really need to consider non-negotiable in each of the subject areas in terms of the content, the order in which things are taught, but also how they are then taught in order to maximise the important things in the long-term memory before the children leave your school. So my third triad element of evaluating the curriculum for SEND pupils is honing in even deeper on this concept of retaining information and skills in the long-term memory. So I've mentioned already the importance of perhaps spiralling the curriculum so that the children have an experience of the curriculum that is planned in a sequence and in a cycle, but a cycle that evolves and either gets tighter or loosens up according to how well they're responding to retaining that information over time. And children with particularly complex special needs and learning difficulties may need this opportunity for repetition and overlearning in a much tighter and more speedy revisit of knowledge, skills and understanding compared to some of their peers. And this is where this model kicks in terms of SEN, because having established the approach for all pupils in terms of quality first teaching and so on, the systems and the planning you've got in place will then allow you to evaluate the impact it's having on each pupil with special needs along this lines of retaining information. And I would look at it in terms of these three elements. Is the planned sequence really having the impacts that you want it to have on your SEND pupils term by term, year by year? And this is where the curriculum needs to be re-evaluated continuously. It's never an end product, I don't think, the curriculum. So, you know, each time evaluating the impacts that the curriculum is having on the long-term memory. And this is where the assessment tools we mentioned earlier are really important. So progress, really, I'm defining as the retention of information and skills in the long-term memory over time. You can apply data to that if it's going to help you with this, but I think choose the right tools for the right subject and the right information to establish the impact the curriculum's having on the pupils in the long-term memory. Similarly, if the child and young person isn't responding as you'd hoped, and you've implemented an intervention, a targeted intervention, which is common practice now, inside the classroom or perhaps outside the classroom sometimes, you can use the same model to evaluate the impact of that intervention. What difference is it making ultimately in helping that child or young person retain information better than they had previously with the quality first teaching and the other strategies that we had previously talked about? And if that intervention isn't having the impact that you want it to have, change it. Just accept that it might have worked with another child in a previous year, but it's not having the impact you want it to have now. And I think it's really important that this is done in a timely manner, not just halfway through the year or at the end of the year, or when it comes to reviewing the EHCP or the IEPs if you're still using those, not just when you're evaluating the targets, but continually. So the point here is that this triad needs to be a continual process, so that week by week, half term by half term, term by term, there is sufficient information being collated in as meaningful ways as possible to evaluate whether or not the provision that you put into place is having the impact that you want it to have on the long-term memory, the choice of teaching strategy, the intervention, the resource, the use of the teaching assistant, the use of the computer, the visual cues, the targeted questioning, the intervention program that you're using. Is it having the impact that you want it to have? And if it isn't, know that before you get to the end of the year, before you decide it hasn't worked, and then move on to something else that hopefully might work. And that's where the interaction between the SENCO and the head teacher and the SENCO and the subject leaders is really important on an ongoing basis. And then finally, the fourth triad is the evaluation of the outcomes. So if the child really does have complex SEN needs, it's very important, as I said earlier, that provision is identified correctly, and that has to be linked to the right measures of success and ensuring that you've got a firm foundation of good quality first teaching, good evidence-based intervention strategies, and good evidence-based pedagogy for supporting children and young people, and then evidencing that, okay, you've tried those, they haven't still had the impact you want them to have on the long-term memory, so you're then getting additional support and advice from beyond your current expertise within the school. Now, in some cases, this might lead to, within the code of practice, an education healthcare plan. But the point I'm making here is that even without an education healthcare plan, the process, I think, when the child has that level of complex needs is still important. So the process here is that we've agreed the child has an SEN need. It's clearly evidenced in your Plan B review cycle based on a good quality curriculum, well planned, well sequenced, high quality first teaching and good evidence-based approaches to teaching and learning. All that's in place, I'm assuming at this point. Then you can argue quite rightly that this young person, child, has specific needs that are complex and needs some really targeted and personalised approaches. And that's the point I'm making here. You're reaching the point here where the curriculum for this individual is becoming personalised because of the complexities of their need. And the code of practice tells us that the ideal approach is to start with the aspirations. Okay, we accept that the curriculum is presenting some significant challenges for this young person. What are our aspirations then? And those aspirations need to be defined with a really strong voice from the child or young person themselves, wherever possible. And where that's not quite possible because of the complexities of their difficulties, a sense of what their voice and what their best interests are need to be established by their parents, their carers, and the professionals involved with that child or young person's life, whether it be speech therapists, whether it be a psychologist, whether it be the family or whatever. So the aspirations of that young person are really important, and it's really important, I would argue, to pin down those aspirations in really understandable, tangible ways that we can understand, and particularly in ways that we can understand when they've been achieved. I see lots of examples where the aspirations are morally right, but they're difficult to understand what they're. So a classic example is, an aspiration for a child to become independent. in adult life. That's a very common example, actually, on an IEP or on a special education healthcare plan. And but what does that actually mean for that particular young person? What are the needs? What are the barriers to that young person achieving some level of independence in the workplace, level of independence in personal care, level of independence in travel? What do we actually mean? And we need to define it very clearly. What do we mean? What are our aspirations for this young person? So is it, in another example of another young person I work with, a young person with autism, their aspiration is to move from college into a university placement and be able to manage their social communication difficulties and their sensory regulation difficulties in the process of doing that. So their target that I've seen written on their EHCP is for them to transition effectively into their next provision. Well, that's not a meaningful target for them. That's a target for the professionals and the teachers to work on. Their target might be, in this particular example, that they utilize a helpful strategy in asking for help when they don't understand the homework that's been set each week. It needs to be specific like that, so that we can actually get some true measures of success. So when you get to this level, I would say if you have young people with the HCPs or you're going through the process of requesting in the HCP, it's really important that within that process, the aspirations are clearly defined and the HCP or the plan that's put into place, if it's not in the HCP, either way, that the targets are clearly linked to true measures of success and clearly defined and meaningful to that young person. And the reason, and one of the many reasons why that's important is because when you're evaluating the impact of the curriculum around that individual, how do you measure success if the outcomes have been written in such a woolly way that you don't know it's been achieved? So the example I gave of the outcome being that by the end of the time they leave this school, they're independent. Well, what does that mean? How do you measure success towards that? How do you say that that curriculum around that particular young person has been successful? So it's really important at this stage and this level that the outcomes are very clearly defined and measurable. So there you are. There are my suggestions for the 4 triads as a model of delving a bit deeper into evaluating the impact of the curriculum for pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, starting from identifying inclusive strategies right the way through to using the systems that you then put in place to evaluate the impact, and that relationship particularly between SENCO, teacher, parents, pupil, and head teacher, I think is more important now than perhaps it's ever been. So let me know your takeaway from the session. Email me, shoot me an email, and let me know what your takeaway has been. But equally, if I can support you in any way with any of the issues that I've mentioned, let me know. Similarly, if you're a leader in education looking for effective strategies for school improvement at the same time as maintaining your own well-being and ability to manage a healthy way of working, I'd be very interested to support you and work with you as well. So perhaps we could have a chat, and again, just shoot me an email sometimes. So good luck, and thank you for investing time with me today.
Hey, it's Ian here at Studio TV. Thank you so much for joining us here at Getting It Right for Me Live. Let me ask you a really quick question. Are you here because you are hoping to develop your skills and your knowledge and all your learning and understanding around supporting and caring for children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities? I assume that's what you've come here for. We hope that you're enjoying your time here with us. There's some amazing people, and we're so grateful for them coming and being part of this. And we're so grateful for you to be joining us as well. There's a couple of things I just really quickly wanted to introduce you to. First of all, don't forget that you can upgrade your ticket at any time to one of the paid tickets, which we try to keep the price as low as we possibly can, just to cover what we need to help out the speakers a little bit, and make sure this event is as good as it can be. What that means is you can access the live Q&A sessions that we're running throughout the event, and you can access all the sessions for up to a year afterwards if you buy one of those paid tickets. Check out the whole school ones. How that works is if you book a whole school ticket, and you can pay online, or you can drop us a line and we'll issue an invoice and we'll sort it all out. That's absolutely fine. But we'll then make it possible for all your staff to be able to access all the sessions here at Getting It Right for Me Live this year. So do hope that's helpful. The other thing I want to mention is, and there are lots of members joining us this week, so thank you so much to those of you who are members, but we have put together, if you're looking to go deeper and access ongoing support and help and training, either as an individual, as a parent, as a professional supporting someone with additional needs, in a school or educational setting, or from a professional point of view, we have put together here at Studio TV with Lynn McCann and her team at Reach Out ASC a fantastic membership that starts at just £10 a month and includes a wide range of courses to help you support those in your care. There's a load of resources and tools, printable things that you can use to work with those children, support them. And there's more content being added all the time. One of my favorite parts of the membership is there is a peer group community that's built into that. So you can ask questions of Lynn and her team and your peers, built right into that membership as well. As I say, it starts at just £10 a month. Whole school memberships are there. We're offering trust-wide memberships, and local authorities have started to get in touch and offer this to their staff across a range of schools as well. We would love for you to join our community. If you've got any questions on that, drop us a line, but very much hope to see you there. And thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the event.